Now, the pads are on for Big Blue. As I had previously gotten a little overhyped, my friends, it is the second week of training camp, and where we get to confirm or deny some of the positive expectations we've built up around certain players, and maybe try to debunk the negative narratives around high-priced talent that could be very important to the Big Blue success this season. It's all coming up next. Ah, yes, friends. It is, of course, OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where we are your host over here, Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the Nets over on the Locked On Nets podcast, Brooklyn style, with my boy Doug Norrie, and yonder there, the season generational ticket holder, the healthy, wealthy, and wise Mr. Andrew Makowitz. How are we, sir, on a Monday?
I'm doing great, Adam. My wife was gone for 5 days in Mexico for a wedding, and I was daddy daycare with my 2.5-year-old for 5 days.
Sure.
Needless to say, Monday feels like a reprieve for me. It feels like I've kind of finally gotten some time back, so I'm feeling great right now. I'm excited.
And you're really happy to have your wife home,
Oh
right?
yes,
You're really
that's it.
happy to have
Yes.
the love of your life, your partner, your everything. And we can edit that. We can use your voice there for those words instead of mine. That's fantastic though, man. As we say, quiet weekend for me. No weddings in Mexico, no kids to watch. But so at the top there, it is now the second week of training camp. The pads do now go on. And this is where we try to decipher, because we did our best to not get over our skis on things we were seeing last week. Some things like positional players and how they look, those are tangible. A lot of this stuff in the trenches is a little bit harder to discern around whether or not there's real value there. You're waiting to see everybody healthy. You're wondering about some guys that could be contributors. So we wanted to dive in on a few of these narratives. Just overall from last week, the positive takeaways that we saw there. Obviously, Darnay Holmes was the big name in the secondary. Really excited to see that. Heard him talk about, went down with the injury, obviously, last season, kind of stunted where he thought his growth was going to go. So, good reminder that he maybe was progressing. And now, with the benefit of really good coaching, it looks like he's taking that next step. Wandale Robinson on the offensive side, right? Obviously, showcasing how good he can be for this team and how immediate the impact that he can be and he can have on the offense. Are there other guys there that you took away from last week where you went, hey, we've really got something here that we can confirm this week?
Yeah, I think Richie James is a name that comes to
Yep.
mind. It's not the sexiest name because we spent a first round pick on Kadarius Toney, we spent a second round pick on Wandale Robinson, we spent $19 million on Kenny Golladay, but Richie James feels like one of those low key signings that has the ability to fill in admirably at that fourth wide receiver position. Could end up being a return specialist in the kick and punt return. He seems like he's got kind of this shiftiness in the speed burst that is exactly what Joe Shane targeted when he went out and got Wandale Robinson. It has Kadarius Toney. I really liked what I've seen from him so far at the start of camp. I think this week could be an opportunity for him to really, entrench himself in one of those 53-man roster wide receiver positions. And then leading up to the Patriots on August 11th, he could be out there returning punts and kicks and being
Yep.
in there in the first and second quarter, contributing at the wide receiver position with a guy like Daniel Jones out there.
Yeah, and you heard a little bit of positive review for CJ Board as well. Obviously, a holdover from the previous regime, also has special teams value. I find them both fascinating, and we won't belabor anything around Darius Slayton, but it is now guys that have special teams value. If you can do a little bit extra, all of a sudden, if you can continue to climb up that pecking order, you make a decision, on the one hand, more difficult for the coaching staff about what they want to do, or maybe easier to say, yeah, we see the quality here. And to your point, the most important thing, whether it's with Daniel Jones in a preseason game or you're getting the reps with the backup, Tyrod Taylor, Davis Webb, etc., you want to see that you can continue to be consistent. And I think a lot of times, one of the things we'll talk about this week and then go into preseason games is it's not always about the result of the rep. It's about the function, right? It's about the process of the rep. So is Richie James, is CJ Board running the route correctly, getting in and out of their breaks, creating separation? Whether or not the pass comes their way, that's the thing you're not going to see when you're watching a preseason game on WPix 11 randomly on a Thursday night or whatever they end up showing it, right? It's going to be, are they grasping the offensive scheme and are they working through that process? And I again, to say all seriously, but I think he's the name now this week. This week is going to be one where, are you showing anything? Is there consistency? Are you showing some of that viability? We're going to get into as well, obviously, Kenny Golladay a little bit later. Just talk about some Peter King conversation, discussion around what he took away from that first week. To stay on the positive side, unless you have any other notes, I'm going to go over to the defense a little bit here. Any other offensive side of the ball things that you want to touch on?
No, because I think the defense is where we're seeing a lot of the highlights. We saw the defense play well on Friday, and I think the defense is where to go. And Adam, I wanted to start with one name that we haven't really talked about as much as I think we should be, and that's Keyvon Thibodeaux, right?
Oh yeah.
He looks explosive. He went one on one against Andrew Thomas, and his first step was tremendous. He has that ability to get into the backfield. He then said, when he went on to say, Andrew Thomas, I can't take a snap off. That guy's unbelievable. And the one thing that I took away is, yes, the production looks like it can be there on the field, but also you hear him in press conferences, you hear him talking to the media. He feels like he is the perfect guy for New York. He's bold, he's brash, but then he also says there's a time to be competitive and go out there and prove it on the field, and there's a time for me to talk and have fun with the media. He seems like a guy that just gets what New York fans and New York media want. They want someone to produce on the field and be exciting off the field, and that's what he's done so far. I'd love to see that continue when they put the pads on.
Yeah, you said it. And listen, the funny thing from last week into this week, we'll get a little better sense because he was asked in some of the media day discussions around, having to hold up, right? You feel like you got the good move and you want to finish off that play with a big hit. He compared it to being like a bull when you see red charge. For us, it's when you see red, you pull up and you just have to condition and train yourself to know that's what's required of us. That's what we have to do. And it'll be fascinating to see what what does it look like in full pads and full go here, because remember last week the offense gets to complete those plays, right? So Thibodeau's going to get there. He's going to get home on Daniel Jones. He pulls up, and then that rep continues out because you still get good production, good opportunities for route running, etc., for Daniel Jones and for the wide receiver group. This week, they may blow those dead because they're going to be sacks. But to your point, I think Thibodeau, man, whatever concern you had, if you had, and I said, he's a loud, bombastic personality. It's a different day and age in the NFL than it was maybe a decade ago, where that type of personality would be, quote unquote, a more of a red flag. Now it's just, the guy is unique. He has his own personality. And I think, like you said, it's really good for New York. And it's great to hear. He talks about positional coaches, talks about Wink. What are they focusing on? It's refinement, right? Refine your skills, refine your tools, get them sharper, because we want you to be as effective as possible right out of the gates. He looked incredibly productive. It'll be fun to see how he looks in pads this week going up against some of these guys. And then defensively, I think the other name to bring up here from positive from last week and now thinking about coming to this week is Elerson Smith. And we talked about him from last year, suffers the injury, doesn't really get a good look here. When you look at the depth chart, edge room, Elerson Smith has every opportunity to step out this week and show now with pads on. Look good without pads. Now, if you show it this week, all of a sudden the Giants and the Wink Martindale can look and say, well, we have a consistent depth weapon here that has some real speed and real length, things that we like on that side of the ball.
Yeah, Adam, Elerson Smith is an interesting name. And the thing about Elerson Smith, when Azeez Ojulari was put on the PUP list, we were wondering who was going to be the first person to take snaps. It was Jihad Ward, actually, that came out and took his place with the ones. And we're all saying, what's going on here? Like, we've got Quincy Roche, we've got Elerson Smith. What's happening? And I think we were all a little bit concerned. It seemed like they were giving the veterans the benefit of the doubt and giving them some run. But Elerson Smith is slowly showcasing that he could be one of these guys that's really interesting. He's got the tantalizing skill set in terms of that first step speed and agility. Everyone in practice is saying that he's a guy to look out for. They're like, man, he could be something. I want to see him with pads on. I want to see him doing it more consistently, Adam. But through the first couple of days, he's clearly a name that people have identified as like, be on the lookout for him in preseason. He could wreak some havoc.
So here's the thing. It'll be fun to watch him, fun to watch a lot of these guys. And we're going to go into some of the maybe concern areas. And again, can we push back on these areas of concern over the course of this week when pads get on? But I did have this thought. For everything that the previous regime did not do well, and we know there's a myriad of them, but over this past week, we heard Andrew Thomas, obviously, really, solidifying himself, looking strong, trying to build off that second season, wants to become a more dominant left tackle. We're really excited about that. Darnay Holmes starts to get mentioned, right? Shane Lemieux is really liked by this new coaching staff and regime. Elerson Smith is really liked by this. Kadarius Toney out there getting solid reps. Like, I did have this momentary pause where I went, man, remember last year injuries, whatever. It's still going to be the past regime did far too many things terribly wrong. However, we are starting to mention a handful of names that are carryovers that this coaching staff really likes and likes what their skill set is. I find that like an Aaron Robinson, what happens with him on the outside when pads get on this week, right? Like there are a lot of young names. I'm not even talking about signings because you can debate those things and the money being spent. But there's a lot of young players now that are being talked about as maybe being quality for this organization going forward, just beyond the short term. I do find that interesting, let's say, because you don't get the benefit of the doubt when you're a regime that drafted poorly potentially in terms of when you chose positions, that made mistakes in free agency and over allocating money. I mean, are we a Matt Pert as a solid backup swing tackle away from saying, hey, Dave Gettleman did give us some things, and that I think comes down to, which I think was the biggest mistake of the previous regime, coaching. Coaching matters, right? The staff matters, and all of a sudden, with what we feel like is the best coaching staff we've had in years, now you're looking at some of these young players very differently. And I'll throw in Julian Love that mix, right? Our perception changed about him over time as well, and Xavier McKinney. Like I want to make sure I fill out this list as full as possible. That's 6, 7, 8 guys that we're talking about pretty highly potentially as we work our way through camp.
It is interesting because I thought the same thing originally, Adam. Like, oh, Elerson Smith, diamond in the rough. They found him. Like, can Aaron Robinson perform? But then I went, hold on.
You do the other
I'm not
names.
going. I'm not. Yeah, like for the one or two that you have, we forget. Like, we're still paying DeAndre Baker. We're still paying him. Like he has dead cap money.
They call that a whoopsie daisy.
And then we're still paying Sam Beal. Corey Ballantyne is no longer on the roster. Sure. We gave Nate Solder the biggest tackle contract. Matt Pert, we don't know if he's going to be there. Like, and then you think about James Bradbury has an $11 million cap hit. Logan Ryan has an $11 million cap hit. Sure. Neither of them are even on the roster. So, like,
we're still paying Jonathan Stewart. Is that over yet?
we're not, but we're paying Devontae Booker $1 million, even though he's not on the roster right now.
So they brought back in for a little tryout run. You see that? Gotta love that one, right?
I know that was pretty interesting. But I mean, when you said it, I was like, yeah, they found them, and I was like, wait a second. Just because they hit on 10% of their draft picks doesn't excuse the other 90%. And
obviously, by the way, the most glaring being when you draft a running back like they did with Saquon and the question mark around Daniel Jones. I know that's the case. It's one of those things where, again, because of all the turnover with this organization, it's supposed to be like a draft class. Talk to me in 3 years. And we're like, yeah, but we're going to have like 19 new members, maybe a new GM, new coaches. So like we kind of need to like know about this within the first 6 weeks.
Right. Well, you talk about Saquon, you talk about Daniel Jones was a pick that we still haven't even fully talked about yet. There's a lot of things. But Adam, I think one area that we talk about is another decision by the previous regime. So Peter King was at Giants training camp, and he decided to take in the sights and see, sounds and see what he liked. He obviously had glowing reviews about Wan'Dale Robinson, but on the concern level, there was one name that popped up that Peter King seemed to be pretty concerned with on the Giants.
Kenneth Golladay, right? That $18 million wide receiver, one of the previous regime's signings, obviously, the big splash play that we thought was going to help maximize what Daniel Jones was going to be and confirm or deny. Remember that when it was like, that's why we signed him, to confirm what Daniel Jones is. Fast forward another season and a half later, and we're going, no, now we'll confirm or deny what he is. The interesting thing I thought was Peter King pointed out not getting a lot of separation for Kenny Golladay over the first week of training camp. Going to get into the second week now, obviously, with full pads on. The thing you could push back on would be, well, Kenny Golladay is not a wide receiver that gets separation. That was never one of his things. It's that he's big. He can use his body. Where do you sit on the concern level around it? Because you and I have differing opinions around what Kenny Golladay needs to be for this team this season. And then even beyond this season, what it looks like. Like I have a very somewhat defined opinion around what Kenny Galladay's shelf life is with the New York Football Giants and what his role is going to be going into this season.
Yeah, so I think it's tough because Kenny Golladay in 2018 and 2019 had over 1,000 yards receiving in both seasons. He had 11 touchdowns in 2019. He was clearly a red zone target that we liked.
Was that for the Giants, or was
it was not? And so when you go to last year, he played in 14 games. He only had 521 yards and 0 touchdowns. 0 touchdowns. By all accounts, it was an extremely disappointing season. But to your point, Peter King points out that there was difficulty with separation. He wasn't a separation guy. He was a high point, go up and get the ball, makes tough grabs in the red zone type of guy. When you look at separation, you think about Kadarius Toney being able to be shifty and get out there.
It's like saying that I have trouble with height. That's always been the case, but I have a step stool, right? Like I can get to
Yeah,
the top shelf if I need to. Kenny Golladay has trouble with separation. Great. It's always been
right.
about other attributes that are valuable to him.
Yeah, like breaking news. Adam has difficulty dunking a basketball on an NBA hoop. Like he has these challenges. It's like, well, were we expecting that? Like, was that the expectation that you had going in there, Peter? Listen,
Nobody takes a charge like me.
uh, well, Adam, the issue with Kenny Galladay for me is what is the role that he is going to play this season? You know that the Giants are making Wan'Dale Robinson, Kadarius Toney, and Saquon Barkley a big focal point. So,
Mhm.
what is the expectation that you want from Kenny Galladay? If you're talking about a big-bodied red zone threat, then to me, it's more about the touchdowns that he has than it is the overall yards that he puts in. He could
Mhm.
have 700 yards and 8 or 9 touchdowns and be extremely productive for this team.
Yeah.
The issue that the Giants have is he's under contract for a few more years. Next year's contract he's basically a $21 million cap hit, and 14 million would be dead cap hit. So the Giants would only save $7 million on Kenny Galladay. So the question is, what does he have to show this year to guarantee that he's going to be on the roster moving into next year?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there are things he could show this year to keep him on the roster, but I don't look at it. There's so many players like this. Leonard Williams with his money, make your decision around where you think he's going to be and what that looks like going forward. We talked about Saquon Barkley before. I'm really hard pressed to say, even if he has a phenomenal year, are the New York Giants going to want to commit $12+ million a year to him? And Peter King talks about this, where the Giants are predicted to have something like a top 7 in terms of cap room going to next off season. So eating dead money on Kenny Golladay doesn't hurt you as much. Yes, he can be a red zone threat. He could only have 500 or 600 yards this year, but if he catches 6 touchdowns, because listen, Kenny, again, we talk about Kadarius Toney. He's neither the smallest nor the tallest. I think all the athleticism can work in the red zone for him. We don't know what Wan'Dale is going to look like in the red zone sets and how valuable he can be. What is Daniel Bellinger's role going to be there? Yes, Kenny Golladay can do enough this year where you go, okay, it's worth it to keep him at the 14, or as opposed to eating the dead cap money. It's worth to keep him on the roster. I don't see a world where the Giants get to next off season and they don't move off of him, whether it's through a low level trade because maybe he still showed some red zone value, or straight taking the dead cap hit, because I just think that progressively, year over year, this team, this organization is going to be turning over this roster, and Kenny Golladay, like, he just doesn't fit. He does not fit overall what this offense is trying to progress towards, whether it's with Daniel Jones or not. I don't see Kenny Golladay as being the ideal version, even of a bigger receiver. There are long, leaner guys that I think would serve Mike Kafka, Brian Dable better inside of this scheme than Kenny Golladay.
I do agree with you that in a vacuum, Kenny Golladay doesn't fully make sense on this roster. But when you expand it out to the wide receiver room and you look around with what the Giants have right now, and you think about what's going to be around next season, it's a little bit of it becomes a little bit murkier because Sterling Shepard is highly unlikely to be coming back to this team. He
True.
restructured it just to be able to stay with the team and rehab and do all that he needs. Darius Slayton has the trade rumors. He might not even make it through preseason training camp. And then you got to have guys like CJ Board, Richie James that are on 1-year prove-it deals. When you remove all of them, really the only two that you have under contract are Wan'Dale Robinson and Kadarius Toney. So to be able to say we're going to get rid of, we're going to eat a $14 million cap hit and free up $7 million on Kenny Golladay, you might have to still fill in 3 or 4 wide receiver positions, knowing that all these guys are all on one-year deals. So I think it's more the complement of the contractual situations of the entire room and less about Kenny Golladay as the player. But again, if he ends up getting hurt or he's limited in action and he can't just stay on the field or isn't very productive, he might force the Giants' hand.
Well, I think too, and I'll just we can close out on this, and then I want to another area of concern, really just a full perspective on what we should be anticipating over the course of this training camp and going into preseason. The last note would be, though, that you have a second round pick that you brought in underneath this regime in Wan'Dale Robinson. You have a first round pick from the previous regime in Kadarius Toney. So while, yes, you only have those 2 pieces potentially going to next season, you're only one more draft pick away from saying we have a first round, a second rounder, and a third round wide receiver. That's the top end of it. And then we fill it out with complementary pieces. And if you go look at teams like Buffalo, though they went out and got their guy for Josh Allen a couple seasons ago, and we saw the big leap that meant for them. But go to Kansas City. I think that the better teams in the league, just on offense or defense, do a good job of drafting, of scouting, of finding players that have the skill sets that fit in. And in some ways, seeing Richie James get talked about positively over the first week of training camp is a reminder. Richie James, he may be a relatively nobody from when he was drafted and what he's done so far. But if he serves the role and he can do X for you consistently, that's how you fill in these gaps. So it'll be fascinating to watch that over the course of it. And by the way, it'll be fascinating to see what happens with Kenny Golladay over the course of training camp and going into the preseason. I'm not closing the door on what he can be for this team in the short term. It just always comes down to how do you progress forward? How do you make smart decisions for the team? The other area would be if we want to get the ball to Kenny Golladay or to Wan'Dale Robinson or to Kadarius Toney. I think that this was this was the good reminder. Feliciano goes down with heat exhaustion last week, hasn't been out there. So we mentioned briefly, it was like, first, okay, where are you going? It ain't going to be Bredesen. It ain't going to be some of these other scrubs. We're going to shuffle over Shane Lemieux and we're going to move Azudu up into a guard role. And on the one hand, you go, sweet, let's get some reps for Azudu, baby. That's what I like to see. But the other side of it is, hey, we're only one injury away, basically across the entire team at any given position from saying, remember, this is a work in progress. It's not going to happen over the course of one off season. If Kadarius Toney goes down, all of a sudden, the strain and pressure on a Wan'Dale Robinson, on a Daniel Bellinger, on a Kenny Golladay, God, does that skyrocket, right? If Feliciano goes down, what happens? All of a sudden, we shuffle the chairs on the Titanic because we need to move all these pieces and players around. There's a lot of reason for optimism, justifiably so. And also, the work isn't done. You can't, we said this at the start of the offseason, start of going towards the draft, of free agency, and where the cap room was. You can't fix everything in one offseason. And some of these little moments are reminders of that, I think, going forward.
I agree with you, Adam. It makes you realize how thin the offensive line still is. We went from being one of the worst 3 offensive lines in the league to a bottom 3rd offensive line in the league,
Yes.
basically, which is progress. And you can't go from worst to first overnight. It takes time, as you mentioned. But there are a lot of question marks. Feliciano got a bunch of guaranteed money and said, I'm finally willing to prove all the doubters wrong. I can play center. I'm moving over from guard. And within one day of practice, he's out for multiple days for heat exhaustion. And you're like,
Whoopsie daisy.
uh-oh, that's not a good sign for a center that we need to be out there, that we need to rely upon. And when you see him unavailable, it makes you think, look at all the gymnastics the Giants have to do in order to have a mediocre offensive line. You got to shift over a guard. You got to bring in a rookie. You really have to move things around. Like, that to me screams, what if Andrew Thomas has an ankle injury? Are we sliding Evan Neal over and then all of a sudden Matt Pert is out there? Like, who's the swing tackle? What are we doing?
Right.
The reminder of Feliciano goes out just shows how thin the Giants are. We're like at the top level, it feels like we are at least competing at a normal level, a league average level. But the second you scratch the surface a little bit more and say, well, who comes in a pinch? We have to start shifting different people around to like unnatural positions, which is a little bit concerning for me.
Well, when you say, right, Andrew Thomas against Thibodeaux and Ojulari against Neal, and then you go, and even though we're excited about what he could do, Elerson Smith against Matt Pert, and who against O'Shane Ximenez or Jihad Ward in a pinch, right? Like, it's only one layer deep, and that's okay. This isn't a negative. It's just the reality of what we have to look at and where I think our expectations should be around this stuff. And hopefully, as we talked about, everyone says injuries happen. We know that. But the organization has historically, over the last handful of seasons, always been on the worst side of the percentages when it comes to injuries and guys missing time. So a big part of what happens over training camp could also just be, how about everyone be mostly healthy? Azeez Ojulari doesn't look like a big deal. Neither does Feliciano. But what happens from here and how these guys get through camp is really important for the Giants' early season success. And I will just take one small victory lap here because I mentioned it the episode before we saw the training camp results when Feliciano wasn't available. I said that I thought, listen, do I think Shane Lemieux can be solid at the guard position this season? Certainly. But in the grand scheme of things, do I think that Shane Lemieux might be a viable center option for the Giants as Azudu emerges at the guard role going forward? Because Feliciano is on a 2-year deal. It doesn't mean that he's a 2-year locked-in starter. It just means that he's a guy that Dable has familiarity with and trusts and believe can be a good, solid offensive lineman and also a good locker room guy, right? Good communicator of the scheme and the system. I think that there is that world where if Dable and this organization from the previous regime likes the carryover Shane Lemieux, don't be shocked. He has all the kind of the makeups and the physical traits of a center. We could be seeing a little bit of a glimpse here through this injury and through some time away for Feliciano of what the future could look like across that line when you want to get younger and you want to get a guy like Uzudu, who's also getting well regarded in training camp, more opportunities.
You know what, Adam? The one other person that I wanted to mention
Sure you do.
that we have to talk about is the Nick Gates news, just because it's a very
Yeah.
positive feel for the Giants. We talked about how he had this gruesome leg injury. Joe Shane came out last week and announced that Nick Gates might be playing in preseason games,
Hi,
which
how are you?
absolutely,
Yeah.
which absolutely blew my mind because I was
Yeah.
thinking to myself, will he even be on this roster? Will they just put him on IR and let him
Did
rehab
that
for the rest of the year?
did that
Like
news
that was
come
crazy
out
to me.
just after Feliciano went out with heat exhaustion and they had to shuffle everyone in the offensive? By the way, Nick Gates is gonna get some time in preseason.
I mean, I couldn't. It probably was right around there.
Gates
To be
gets the
honest
alert
with
on
it,
his phone.
he's like,
Whoa,
"Oh, it
okay.
looks like I'm up. Let's
Yep.
hopefully this leg's okay." But I mean, that's another name for us to look at because we were
Yep.
all excited when he kicked over to center, saying, "Oh, he might actually solidify that position." We signed him to an extension. Like we were ready to commit to him as our center, and then the gruesome leg injury happens. But you're hearing that his rehab is going unbelievable, and that even though it was a terrible, terrible injury, the fact that he may be out there in days or weeks and not months has to be encouraging.
Yeah, I and again, rewind it, right? Previous regime, Nick Gates was a part of that. You mentioned the injury, the terrible, horrific injury for him. I do wonder if 100% healthy coming out of last season, how would the organization and the new coaching staff look at Nick Gates coming in? Would they have bothered to sign Feliciano? Or if they had signed Feliciano, would it have been, hey, you want to get some backup reps at center? You're good for the guard positions, right? Some nice depth experience piece from Buffalo. Great. I think maybe you would have looked at it differently if you had had a healthy sample of Nick Gates, who was coming along and progressing. Again, always hard to contextualize it because the offensive line has been in such a state of flux. We don't know where is really any of these players in the hierarchy of the NFL. So keep an eye on that for sure. The last piece, as you mentioned on the side here in the private chat, it won't go away. So we'll give some coverage to it here. We're focused on the team and what they can accomplish. I'll put it in context this way. It was discussed that either one of two things: the San Francisco 49ers either could outright release Jimmy Garoppolo or do a situation where they're going to manage the money, eat a chunk of the contract, etc. So we talked about this before. The reports, you can put the full details of it, in talks Jimmy Garoppolo with the Giants. Is that real? Are we supposed to take that as being real?
I mean, Adam. So it's a reports are coming out of San Francisco that Jimmy G is in talks with the Giants. I don't even know what that means.
It's off of the Daily Snark. Is that even a real website? Is that reputable?
I mean, there's a few reporters that are reporting it that they're taking it from, but there's a handful of websites that are saying it. Okay, aside from all the logistical gymnastics that the Giants would have to do in terms of like salaries and things like that, like put it off to the side for 1 second. There is only one world where this makes any sense at all. I was trying to think about like, is there even a world that this exists? And there is one, and there's only one
Okay,
that I
go
can
ahead.
think of,
What is it?
Adam. It is that Joe Shane and Brian Daboll look around and they are more impressed with the roster than they originally thought. And while Joe Shane has said this is going to be a multi-year rebuild, they think that they can compete today. That is the only way. And I'm not saying that it would be right or wrong for them to think this, but then they turn around and say, we know that Jimmy G has won football games before. When
Right.
healthy, he can get out there. If we can bring him in somehow, some way
Well,
under the salary cap, then hey, like we have a veteran quarterback that is more aligned to us winning now than we originally thought. Like that's the only way that this makes sense, right?
well, and it's funny, okay, because I know, and this is just the food for thought. It's the back end of the episode. Because to your point, so the only way that this is even remotely a possibility of a conversation of another to talk is, I'll even go more importantly, is that Daniel Jones doesn't look like he has any shot of being the franchise quarterback, right? Like that's
Right,
phase
right.
one. And I know that's what you're including that as a part of it. And if you say, well, we think maybe we're a 7-win team, and with Jimmy G, maybe that makes us a 9-win team, right? Maybe we're pushing for a playoff spot because we know his win percentage, we know what he's done as an NFL quarterback. And I guess you would have to maybe go that extra leap of how successful you think you can be this season, because the guy that schematically fits and is what Kafka and what Dable would want just in a stopgap is Tyrod Taylor, who's on the roster. However, Tyrod Taylor is a low 62, 63% completion percentage, right? He does a nice job protecting the football, doesn't do necessarily a great job pushing it downfield and making the explosive plays, but he's the mobile quarterback. He's the guy that can use his legs as well. And I do wonder what that ratio in that scenario. Daniel Jones isn't the guy, but we also like what we're seeing from our team. What is the splitting hairs there for the Giants? Because if you think, even if you think you could win, even in your scenario, I'll say why it doesn't make sense. Even if you think that you could be more competitive now in this moment than you first realized, are you committing to Jimmy G longer term? Because otherwise, like, what are you doing? Like Garoppolo, maybe it's an opportunity to come in, reset your value, right? Go into the offseason next year and make a really big payday with the Giants or otherwise. But it's a fine line of saying, like, what are we going to commit for a season or two if ultimately we still know we're going to go back into the draft next year and we're going to get a quarterback? And I'll say why it doesn't make sense, because unless you think Jimmy G is your quarterback for the long term, you just go with Tyrod Taylor if Daniel Jones shows that he can't do it in the course of camp, because that means you're still going to find that sweet spot of having a higher draft pick and being able to go and get your quarterback, your franchise guy, in a very deep class next season. So there's a lot of needles that would be you'd be threading here. I understand, and I've said this before. I'm not saying, as you mentioned, right or wrong, making a move like this. I get why a team would do it, because Jimmy Garoppolo, for whatever he isn't, what he is an NFL experienced quarterback that knows how to win games, and you could immediately plug him in and say, he makes us a better football team. He wins us more games as soon as he steps on the field.
And Adam, at the end of the day, I think you and I want to talk more about the players that are in camp, that are on the Giants roster, as opposed to Jimmy
100%.
Garoppolo. So that we'll leave this off to the side unless there's some earth-shattering news that comes out. But honestly, at the end of the day, the pads are on. We're gonna have to see what Daniel Jones can do. We mentioned before about some of these guys to look at this week, see if the trends continue from last week with guys like Elerson Smith and Wan'Dale Robinson, Darnay Holmes, and let's see if guys like Darius Slayton, Kenny Golladay, and others can step up and maybe shed some of the negative news and notes that have come out from the past week.
Yeah, and we're not doing the thing where everyone said you don't overreact to some interceptions from Daniel Jones in training camp with no pads on. We don't start pushing this massive panic button and say this is why it's over. I can't remember, some nonsensical knucklehead on social media saying, like, I'm going to keep pushing the narrative. It's all coming undone here. Like, even if it doesn't work out with Daniel Jones, there is a 19-step process of how this thing moves forward. But I'm going to look about how he starts to look at pads get on here. How many would have been sacks because Daniel Jones holds onto the football too long? How many missed connections does he have? This is a part of the evaluation process that you are doing on every single position. First and foremost, Daniel Jones in the QB spot. And that's why you get over to YouTube, you subscribe to the channel, you share it with your friends, you enjoy all the great content that we're putting out there for you as we cover training camp and we move towards August 11th, first preseason game, get some real reps out there on the field, get us where we get those podcast needs fulfilled. And in the meantime, as Andy Makowitz would want, need, nay, demand that people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.